Every attendance case starts the same way. Nothing happens. A late arrival, a call out, a pattern no one documents, and months later, that silence becomes evident. Attendance problems rarely start with a termination, but they almost always end with one if ignored. In this episode of the HR Investigations podcast, we're breaking down why attendance is often the first red flag in deeper workplace problems, and how what HR does early determines whether a decision is defensible later.
Welcome to the HR Investigations podcast, exploring the issues, challenges, strategies, and solutions. Sponsored by RPCHR and hosted by Natalie Ivey, an HR consultant, licensed PI, and author of the best-selling book, How to Conduct Internal Investigations, a practical guide for human resource professionals. And now, here's Natalie.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the HR Investigations podcast. I'm Natalie Ivey, your host, and I'm happy to have you with me. And for my regular listeners, you probably noticed I've been away for a minute. I had to take a little bit of time off. A couple of things. I moved. I sold my larger horse property in DeLand, Florida, and bought another house, and so put a lot of stuff in storage. I'm renovating a house. That's a lot of fun. It's still not done. And also, I enjoyed some time off around the holidays, and then unfortunately had some health issues that really just kind of set me back. So I am really happy to be back. I've bounced back, and I'm super happy to be with you today. Now, as we kick off the new year, I wanted to start with a series of some podcast episodes. Today will be the first one where we're going to talk about attendance being the first red flag in some deeper employee issues. But the reason why I'm devoting this year and kicking things off with this topic is that I'm hearing a lot of this coming from our clients here at RPC. Attendance just seems to be kind of a hot button right now. Employers are really struggling with people just showing up. Now, some of you are in maybe more professional settings and maybe you're not seeing it, but my clients that have a greater non-exempt population, a lot of shift workers, they're finding that attendance is really a problem. And so what we're going to do is kick things off with today's episode discussing attendance. And then we're going to cover a few things in subsequent episodes where I'm going to be talking about call-in policies and even job abandonment. And then we're going to dig into documentation and also disciplinary action. We'll get into some investigative stuff. So that's going to be, our first few episodes of the year where I'm going to be devoting to this topic. So let's go ahead and dig in here. All right. Look, every attendance case kind of starts the same way. Nothing happens. It's just a late arrival, a call out, a pattern that nobody's documenting. And months later, that silence really then kind of becomes evidence. All right. So attendance problems rarely start with a termination, but they almost always end with one if ignored. All right, today we're going to be talking about why attendance really is kind of the first red flag in deeper workplace problems, and also why, what HR does early determines whether decisions are going to be defensible later. Attendance is really not operational. It's really behavioral, isn't it? Chronic lateness, frequent absences, predictable call-outs, they typically reflect disengagement. Boundary testing, sure. I mean, employers are going to really see if a manager is serious, if they really are going to issue them any kind of written reprimand. And then also a lack of supervision. And then also when expectations aren't really enforced, attendance expectations, employees really do learn exactly kind of how much, they can get away with. So let me share with you a story from my own career involving an employee named Joshua. He was not my direct employee, but he worked for one of the managers who worked for me. This is before I started RPC, but it really just is one of those employee cases that just sticks with you as a leader. So I'm running a very large call center. I used to work for American Express. A lot of you who listen know that I used to work there, and that was my last corporate gig before I started RPC. And anyway, Joshua was a good employee when he was there. He was great with customers. He had a very engaging personality and was a good problem solver. He really just was a good rep, and he serviced our small business account holders. Anyway, the problem was his attendance was atrocious, and he continued to move through the levels of counseling. Now, whether it's still that way to this day, I'm not certain, but back in the day, it was level 1 counseling, then a level 2 counseling. And then when you got to a level 3 counseling statement, that's basically your last and final written warning, and Buster, you're 1 foot out the door. And if you come in late, you come in, you call in and it's an unexcused absence and you have no PTO to cover it, you are going to wind up losing your job. All right. So his team leader said, Nat, do you think you could possibly talk to Josh? She said, I've tried to get through to him, and I'm just worried that this is an employee that we're going to lose. And I can tell you, in that corporate culture, I would imagine it's probably still very evident today, but we were very laser focused on employee turnover. We did a lot of investment in our talent, and we certainly didn't want employees walking out the door. So this was a management issue for us to solve. What do we need to do in order to get this employee to be more engaged and to come to work and not wind up just, losing him? We had him on board. He was with the company about 18 months by that time. So there was a lot of training and investment that the company had made. All right. So I said, fine, let's have a look at his file. And I looked at it and, oh man, he just really had a lot of disciplinary action for attendance. But yet, a lot of customer accolades. That's the part about it that was really quite puzzling, is that he was good at his job. So anyway, I bring him in, meet with him, and I said, do you know why Wendy's asked me to speak with you? Why your manager wanted me to talk with you today? He's like, well, yeah, I guess you want to talk to me about like my level 3. And I said, yeah. And I said, what's going on? And he just kind of sat there and it was, I don't know. I said, well, I think you probably do know, but you're really just not necessarily sharing. And so I kind of went into my investigator mode to probe and try to get below the surface with him and figure out what was the root cause. And I said, Josh, you do such a great job when you're here. I said, I've listened to your calls. I see the way you engage with our customers. And I said, technically, you're very, very good at your job. And I said, and from a service delivery standpoint, you do a great job. And I talked with him about his metrics. And I said, but the one thing that really does seem to be the problem here is you being here. And he's like, yeah, I know. And I said, okay, let's talk about that a little bit more. And then I said, what is it that you're kind of thinking about when you're just not coming to work? And he's like, well, seriously, it's just I have other stuff that I just want to do instead of being here. And I said, okay, well, what kind of other stuff? And, essentially what it was hanging out with some of his friends. And he had quite a few friends that were in the bar business and they worked nights. And so, when they had stuff that they wanted to go do that sounded enticing, he's young, he was probably 23 years old, and, in that job in the call center, that wasn't his lifelong dream to be doing. And I said, okay, so I get it. You want to go spend time with your friends and, you don't have the time that you can get off from work. And I get that. But I said, I need you to help me kind of understand what your next move is going to be. If you have another unexcused absence here in the next 6 months and, you are given your termination document. And his eyes got kind of wide. And I remember very distinctly his body language. And I said, what's your plan? What are you going to do? And I said, I understand you have an apartment, right? And you live with some roommates. I said, how's that going to work when you don't have income coming in to pay your share of the rent? Can't pay the light bill. And I said, look, Josh, you've got a great gig here. I said, you've got a great company. I said, you have wonderful benefits. And I said, you're making pretty good money. I mean, this was a young man that was pulling in at that time between 65 and 70K a year. Okay, that was 25 years ago. This is circa about late 2000. So almost 26 years ago. And that's a pretty good living back then. That's even a pretty good living for some young people right now who are in their early 20s. And it was because he was making a base plus some commissions in the call center. And I said, I can tell you that it's going to be kind of difficult for you to really recover, first of all, after being fired from a job. I said, because that's going to be known that you are not rehirable. And I said, so that's a barrier that you're going to have the next time you go to apply for a job, and then going to get another job that's going to be paying you what you're paying here, what you're getting paid here. And I said, look, I want to help you. I said, What can we do to help you get here? And he just thought that was kind of an odd way that I approached it, but I made it more of a we problem instead of just on him. And I said, no, seriously, what can we do? I just let the silence kind of hang heavy. He's like, well, honestly, he's like, since we're talking about it, he's like, I really don't like this job a whole lot. I said, okay, well, what don't you like about it? So then we kind of picked that apart. And, he didn't like some of the angry, irate customers. Nobody does. Nobody likes being screamed at, but especially when stuff's not your fault, but you bear the brunt of it. And I said, well, that is a job. It is customer service. And I said, but you have opportunity here. I said, this is a company that has 80,000 employees globally. So there are lots of different business units. There are lots of places you could go. And then I began to talk with him a little bit more about his career. He got kind of excited. I could see him visibly kind of perk up. And I said, now, here's the deal, though. You aren't going to be able to really do anything in posting for another position until another 6 months at least. And I said, the reason is you got to clean up your record, Josh. I said, right now, there isn't another supervisor in this building that would want to bring you into the fold because they wouldn't want to take the risk that in, a minute, you're going to wind up losing your job for calling in when you don't have any PTO. He's like, well, I get that. And so then we had a bit of a career discussion. And then I talked with him about also demonstrating integrity and having respect for his teammates. And I said, you do realize when you call off, that means that others are having to pick up the slack, right? Well, yeah. And I said, is that really fair? He's like, well, no, I guess it's not. And so then one thing led to another, and one thing that was very interesting that I want to share with you here. This was the first time he was working at a job that really did have accountability. He's like, well, I now know that you're really serious. Because I said, help me understand kind of not getting this turned around after the first counseling, the second counseling statement, which were the disciplinary levels. And he said, well, now with the level 3, I know you guys are really serious. He had the epiphany at level 3 counseling. Okay, well, finally he gets it. And he realizes that he's got to turn it around. But I imagine that some of you probably have employees who it is the same. If they worked previously at jobs that were not maybe with larger corporations with a lot of structure around how they manage things, they don't have very distinct policies. Sure, employees were probably cut a lot of slack. And that's basically what he said. He said, I now know that you're really serious about it. And he's like, and look, I don't want to lose my job. He's like, I can't afford to lose my job. All right. So he really recognized the need to not lose something that it was going to be a pretty big deal if he did. And you know what? After that conversation, he turned it around. And I gave him a little bit of mentorship, a little bit myself, but then I also gave him to another one of my colleagues that I felt was, his name was Isaac, who worked in a different department. And I asked him to really take Josh kind of under his wing. And I said, look, I think this is a young man that's got a future. He just needs to kind of have a little bit of direction. And he's obviously just kind of, wilting here like a flower in this call center and customer service. But I think he's really got some skills. He had pretty good analytical ability and stuff. All right. So disengagement is definitely one of those root causes. His, I think, it was that disengagement. But once he got that spark of, I don't have to stay here forever. Let me tread water in this job another 6 months. I can tough it out if I know that there's something else that is going to be a better opportunity for him, right? That can really kind of light that fire and turn things around. But I'll bet you a lot of supervisors, they aren't willing to put in the time. They just kind of figure, oh, well, here he is. He's the last and final warning. Well, give it 5 minutes and I'm just going to wind up firing him. And you know what? In my own experience, that is often the case, right? But I just gave you a model for how supervisors could possibly position this to turn it around and also to find out what the root causes are to the disengagement. But also, let me just tell you, boundary testing and also even a lack of supervision are part of the problems as well, all right? When attendance expectations are just not enforced, employees really do learn exactly what they're going to get away with and also with which managers. And you know what? In an investigations, that tolerated behavior really becomes evidence of that acceptance. When we have inconsistencies also in how we're enforcing the policy, well, that opens up a whole other can of worms. I'll talk about that in a little bit. All right. So one absence, though, is an incident, but then repeated absences really become a pattern. And as investigators, right, we don't evaluate events in isolation. We really look for trends over time. Are we dealing with Mondays and Fridays or employees taking days off that bracket their off days? Are they calling off after disciplinary action, before or after holidays? Right. The patterns tell the story, and it's important that we don't miss that. All right. Unchecked absenteeism in organizations really does affect morale, doesn't it? It creates scheduling problems. And I'll tell you, it also creates a risk to your organization's metrics, your profitability, productivity metrics, and certainly service delivery. Those of you who have employees that are in shift environments, I mean, think about an LPN in the emergency room that is supposed to start shift at 7, and that's a 12 o'clock shift. When that nurse calls off and less than an hour before start of shift, well, guess what? The rest of that staff after shift change is going to be scrambling to fill holes and take care of patients and answer call bells. Okay. So even if you're not in a healthcare setting, you get my meaning here. You could be a truck delivery service where you're delivering washers and dryers, or you could be a retail store where someone's late and the store doesn't open on time, and now the shopping mall is fining you. Okay, whatever it is, there are going to be risks. And the longer that behavior is tolerated, the harder it is to correct, and the easier it's going to be to challenge also legally. Okay. Now let's look at things through an investigations lens. All right, attendance records often become Exhibit A, all right, like time logs, call-in notes, written warnings, or like the counseling statements I was discussing the levels with Josh. They show what the employer knew and when they knew it. The early documentation, and that means managers, supervisors, that early documentation protects employers. The silence on the matter does not. All right. Now, attendance problems, they rarely start with termination, but remember, they almost always end there if they're ignored. So what do we need to do? All right, I recommend, since it's here at the beginning of the year, review your attendance policy. Is it working for you? Is the policy too complicated? Do you have one of these ridiculous point systems that managers can't keep count, HR can't keep count, and the employees certainly can't count, right? And, employees who exceed a certain level of points should receive a disciplinary warning, but then that just never really happens. You see, if you've got complex attendance policies that nobody really understands or they're not followed, then that probably needs to be revised. All right. Do your managers know and understand your policy? Are employees failing to adhere to the policy? And if so, why? All right. Have your managers received training on how to enforce the policy? Are you putting new supervisors into a leadership role and they've never even read the policy? Okay, that's problem number one. All right, look, these are all things that HR needs to review and close the gaps on to minimize the risk here to the organization. And as I said at the beginning, in future episodes, I'm going to be discussing things like call-in policies, documentation, and also investigations around this subject of attendance. Now, before we wrap up today, I want to share an opportunity for those of you who want to deepen your investigation skills. My next 2-day virtual investigations workshop is coming up on February 17th and 18th from 11 to 5 Eastern Time. And right now, I've got the early bird premier access pricing. And when you register during this period, you're also going to snag a complimentary copy of my book, How to Conduct Internal Investigations, a practical guide for HR professionals. And also by attending, you're going to get some continuing education credits. So if you've already got your certification in HR, either your SHRM CP or you have your PHR or SPHR, you're going to receive 10 credits. And you're also going to receive the Certified HR Investigator badge. This you can showcase on LinkedIn and on your professional profiles. Now, this virtual workshop, it is filling up quickly, and I limit space in my virtual classes. So I want to make sure that everybody has the chance to ask questions and interact. I don't like having these big, huge, like webcast kind of things where I've got 50 people. I like to limit it so it's an intimate class and that we have some really, really good discussion. So if professional development's a priority for you this year, you'll find the registration link in the show notes for today's episode. Until next time, always remember, the best investigation is the one you don't have to do. See ya.
Thanks for joining us today on the HR Investigations Podcast. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share the show with any colleagues who will benefit from our strategies and solutions. For free bonus resources, simply visit hr-investigations.com. And remember, if you'd like some help with improving your investigative skills, or if your organization is in need of an external investigator to help with the case, please get in touch with us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.